Hello YouTube, Bane666 here. So let's continue with Thomas Smith and his review of the Red Pill. This is his part 2. If you haven't seen the previous episode in this series, I recommend you watch that before watching this. In it, I speculate that possibly Thomas Smith hasn't watched the movie, but instead is relying on various feminist articles, including The Village Voice, as we will see in this episode, where we look at some more interesting coincidences. These are a couple of things that made me stop and scratch my head and wonder if he's actually watched it. If he has watched it, then it's very strange, some of the things he says and some of the choices he makes. But, you know, I'll let you make up your own minds. So without any further delay, let's get stuck into it.
Okay, so the first issue I'm going to reference, I'm not going to delve into, is family court being biased against men. So that's one of the claims of the film. And I think what frustrates me is they just have some weird, one-sided... She interviews one guy about what his ex-wife did to him. And okay, that's fine. I'm open to there being stories of where the system goes wrong. I mean, that can happen either way. I mean, take the example of, you know, mass incarceration disproportionately affecting black men. Well,
you mean disproportionately affecting men in general, Thomas. Not just black men, but men in general. But anyway, back to the Red Pill. You say she just interviews one guy. This is very, very suspicious, Thomas. Have you watched the movie? I have to ask, have you fucking watched the movie? Because the main men's rights talking point, the main issue which is talked about, is parental rights. And Cassie J looks at parental rights from every conceivable angle. I haven't gone through the movie with a stopwatch in hand, figuring out exactly how long she spends talking about it, but I would have to guess at very least 30 minutes. If not 40 minutes, out of a 2-hour movie. She talks about parental alienation, including a story of a young man who committed suicide after losing custody of his child. There are news stories. There's talk about men being tricked into becoming fathers. There are other stories of men who are raising children who aren't theirs. They think they're theirs, and then they find out they're not, because their wife's been cheating on them. And in some cases, they're still financially responsible for these children. She talks about the family court and custody and shows statistics, and she spends a long time talking about all the options that mothers have and how fathers' options are next to none. That every single father's option is influenced or controlled by the mother's options, and how unfair and unequal it is. So I find it absolutely amazing that someone who has supposedly watched the movie is unaware of all this. How did you not see all this, Thomas? Are you suffering blackouts? Do we need to contact your doctor, Thomas? We're worried about your health. Because you seem to be having massive blackouts. At least during this movie. It's very strange that you would say she just interviews one guy and then dismiss the major talking point in the movie as if that's all it is. Very, very strange, Thomas. And I'm sure it's just a coincidence that the story you're about to talk about is one of the issues raised in The Village Voice. But we'll explore that more in a minute.
Oh, yeah, there's going to be white men that it also affects. I mean, I think there are plenty of white men who are in prison for the wrong reasons, too. It doesn't mean, if I support Black Lives Matter and I support criminal justice reform, it doesn't mean that I want white people in prison. It just means that I recognize that it disproportionately affects a certain group.
Yeah, men, Thomas. It disproportionately affects men. You should know this because you're talking about the sentencing gap later on. So, now I will agree it does affect black men more because they get hit twice, once with race and once with gender. But gender is still 6 times the factor that race is. So the very notion that you only want to talk about black men or only concentrate on black men is very telling.
And so that's what I would put this case in. I also think there wasn't any follow-up done. So if you're going to do a documentary, we're going to examine these issues, maybe try to contact the ex just to see if maybe there's another side of the story, because it gets really paranoid where this gentleman starts talking about how his mom wanted to make the kid that he didn't get access to custody of. She tried to make him fat and all this stuff, like just weird claims where it's like, okay, what am I doing with this? Like, do I know that's true? It's just one guy talking.
Now, once again, in the context of the amount of time Cassie J spends talking about parental rights, this is only one minor story. It's not the main focus of the documentary. If the documentary was about this one particular individual and his story, that was the main focus of the entire thing, then yes, you would be right. She should have gone and talked to the ex. But we're talking about one small part of a 2-hour documentary, Thomas. Now, is it paranoid to say that his ex was making their child fat? Is it like some kind of weird conspiracy theory and it's not believable? Well, actually, it's quite believable. There is a condition called Munchausen by proxy. In fact, it mainly affects women. And a sufferer from Munchausen by proxy will make their child sick, sometimes even killing their child, to get sympathy and attention. So if we can believe that some women can do that, it's really not that inconceivable that one woman might purposely make her child overweight, especially considering she was very overweight herself. Thomas also left out the bit where this particular individual explains that he had to give up fighting for custody because it was destroying his health. And you can see the pain on his face that he had to do this. It's a real emotional moment, but for some reason Thomas doesn't talk about that.
After 14 years, my body gave out. I got sicker than I've ever been. I realized I'm going to die. That's not going to do anybody good. I've got to give up the fight. And so I gave up custody. And so I don't see my son anymore. He hasn't been in my house since. So I did lose him.
Just like a dream.
Maybe he went to the toilet at that point. Maybe, you know, he had to take a toilet break, and instead of pausing the video, he just got up and left and missed that rather important part of the story. I don't know. Or maybe it's the blackouts again. It's hard to say. But purely by coincidence, the only article which mentions this that I've been able to find is the Village Voice article. It says, "I didn't quite follow this one. One father's conviction that the women who had custody of his son were systematically trying to make the boy fat. The story drags on forever, and Jay cuts from it to footage of herself tooling around in her car, driving past a Supercuts." Now, purely coincidentally, the Village Voice article also hits all the same points that Thomas talked about earlier in his podcast, which I covered in the last video. It talks about the funding, it talks about Cassie J not being harsh enough on people like Paul Elam and the terrible things he said in the past, and it questions Cassie J giving up her feminism. Now, those elements are also covered in other articles. They're fairly popular points. But the one about the overweight kid isn't. Now, there's something else in the Village Voice article which we will cover later on. Just another coincidence, apparently. But in the meantime, back to Thomas.
You know, I mean, if you wanted to follow up and interview the ex, maybe that would be something. But otherwise, there's nothing. I'm more interested in what are the stats, what's happening at large, like what is the system. It's possible there can be a hiccup in the system, but in the larger scheme of things, what's happening? So that's what I want to know.
Yeah, those are all things that Cassie talks about in the movie. You would know this if you've actually seen the movie. Those blackouts are sounding really serious, Thomas. I'm serious. I'm concerned about your health, mate. You really should see a doctor about them.
And I'm not going to answer that question with respect to family court, because I actually found someone who would be a really good interview. And I say found. She found me. I was doing some research for this, and I had looked into my email. I'd searched something to find an old email that I wanted to pull up, and I found one that I hadn't seen. I feel really bad, but I hadn't seen where a divorce attorney had reached out to me after I did the Red Pill Part 1 and said, hey, this is something I know a lot about. If you want to interview me, let me know. And I hadn't seen it. Sorry, I get a lot of emails, and sometimes they just slip through the cracks.
Last week, another woman I'm acquainted with posted on Facebook about how she had written an email to a guy about something business-related and had received no response from him for several days. Then a male colleague of hers emailed the same guy about the same thing and received a response in a matter of hours. In the comments beneath that Facebook post, another guy said to my friend, well, maybe the first guy just didn't see your email.
I was doing some research for this, and I had looked into my email. I'd searched something to find an old email that I wanted to pull up, and I found one that I hadn't seen. I feel really bad, but I hadn't seen where a
And the second guy's email is the one he responded to because that's the one he saw. Perfectly reasonable explanation that also just so happens to exonerate the guy who ignored my friend's email of any possible display of sexist bias on his part, however unwittingly. It's all so very innocent.
Now, I know this is a little bit of a tangent, and I've got a lot to get through in this video, and it's looking like it's going to be over an hour, but I couldn't pass this up. This is why people have a problem with social justice and with identity politics used by people who promote social justice, Thomas. It's because they see the world through a lens where every single act that anyone does is based on racism and sexism. Doesn't matter if there's another explanation, it's always racism and sexism. So you simply missed an email. That's perfectly understandable. That's the type of thing that happens probably tens of thousands of times a day, maybe millions. I have no idea how many emails are sent in a day. I imagine it's an extremely high number. And from time to time, people are going to miss emails, especially if they're busy and they get a lot of emails. But Steve's friend, being a feminist, interpreted this as an act of sexism because she's a woman in the workplace, and therefore this man must have ignored her because she's a woman. And there is no other explanation. And when someone tried to point out that, you know, maybe he just missed it, that is also seen as an act of sexism. You can't even try to offer another explanation without being accused of being a sexist. So, I hate to inform you of this, Thomas, but apparently because you missed an email, you innocently just didn't see it. Apparently by the standards of your own side, you're a sexist bigot who hates women and you don't take them seriously in the workplace. Now that's not my opinion. I'm with you, mate. I think you just missed it. But according to Steve Shives and other people on your side, you're just a misogynist, mate. Anyway, back to the Red Pill.
Really sorry about that, but I contacted them. It was short notice, of course, so we're going to have to do that interview another time. But I think that'll be a great topic because she has all kinds of stories of kind of both ways, you know, where the system, men are trying to take advantage of it, or women are actually trying to take advantage of the system. It happens both ways. I'm very curious to get her views and what she thinks about, like, overall, is there bias one way or the other? And I'm open to that. So we'll set aside that issue. That's going to be for a later date. And let's talk about some other issues. Now, here's where I'm going to throw another little olive branch to the MRAs, or anyone concerned with these issues. There's a point where they say, someone is quoted as saying something essentially as, if men can't understand the female experience, then you need to listen to men to understand the male experience. And I want to throw first one bit of context in that. The white male voice has been the dominant voice in our society forever.
Okay, I'm going to give Thomas the best case scenario here. Let's, for the sake of argument, say Thomas is 100% correct and that the white male voice has been the dominant voice in society forever, as he says. Personally, I see things as a little bit more complex, but, let's go with Thomas's perspective. That doesn't change the fact that men have been restricted by gender roles. And it doesn't mean that women understand what it's like to be men or to have the male experience. Well, actually, one woman did. She lived as a man for some time and came out of it with a rather different perspective.
She continued her emotional descent and a week later checked into a hospital with severe depression. Identity, she concluded, was not something to play around with.
When you mess around with that, you really mess around with something that you need that helps you to function. And I found out that gender lives in your brain, and it's something much more than costume. And I really learned that the hard way.
Norah says she's healed now and glad to be rid of Ned. But her views about men have changed forever.
Men are suffering. They have different problems than women have, but they don't have it better. They need our sympathy, they need our love, and they need each other more than anything else. They need to be together.
Do you think women understand what it's like to be a man?
Not at all. No clue. No idea.
John Guarnaschelli thinks Norah's conclusions that men are just as emotionally vulnerable as women are important and will be taken seriously because they came from a woman.
I said to her, this is going to be revolutionary, because it's been looked at as though men were the perpetrators and women were the victims. This is not
and now, one last identity
Go
switch.
yourself.
Guarnaschelli has never come face to face with the real Norah.
Hi, John. I'm Norah.
Hi. Wow. Bruce teaches, so we can never come to the meetings. So.
And both John and Norah are happy she is a she. The irony is not lost on Norah that it took a trip into manhood to help her appreciate her own femininity.
I'm so much closer to myself than I ever was, that I really like me. I really like being me, and I really like being a woman.
Did you like being a woman before Ned?
I did, but I like it more now, because I think it's more of a privilege.
That's perfect right there. That's awesome like that. Nice.
And Thomas is also suggesting that because the so-called ruling class has mainly been white and male, that somehow represents all males everywhere, including non-white males and males who aren't in the ruling class, despite being white. Excuse the pun, but I don't think it's as black and white as Thomas would like us to believe.
Forever. It's only recently that we're at all letting the dominant voice, or not even the dominant voice, like that we're even allowing other groups to chip away at that narrative. I mean, just look at this Me Too stuff. Look at how many reactions there were of, oh, I had no idea this was going on. Wow, I didn't know this was going on. Well, women have had to develop whisper networks and stuff like that because they aren't listened to when it comes to these things. They're, something I quoted somewhat recently in an episode, I'm blanking on which one, where if women reported sexual harassment, they actually, a majority of the time, would face more consequences.
And if a man reports sexual harassment, Thomas, what do you think the reaction's going to be then? Or what if a woman is accused of sexual harassment, Thomas? What do you think the reaction will be in that circumstance? In fact, a very close female friend of mine was accused of sexually assaulting someone. Needless to say, she was perfectly innocent. And her boss, who was also female, when she heard there was a sexual assault allegation, she was willing to go to war until she found out it was against a female, in which case she didn't even bother investigating it. Now, this really pissed off my friend because she wanted her name cleared 100%. She wanted no doubt that she was innocent. But considering her boss was not taking the allegation in any way serious because it was against a woman, she had to push for that. Now, you may say it's discrimination against women, but I would argue that it's a consequence of only seeing males as perpetrators and females as victims, which is the very thing pushed by many feminists, many mainstream feminists.
They would be ostracized, that sort of thing. So the dominant male voice, it's one thing to say, yes, there are some issues, and this is where, again, I'll throw a little olive branch. I think there are actually some issues where we do need to listen to men. And here's what I'll throw out there. I think one valuable place for men in this conversation is to talk about toxic masculinity.
Okay, Thomas, let me make an argument just to make a point. I'm playing devil's advocate here. I'm not suggesting that I actually believe this. Let me be clear about that so I'm not strawmanned. But if we're going to refer to the negative aspects of masculinity as toxic masculinity, then wouldn't it be reasonable to refer to the negative aspects of the African American community as toxic black culture or toxic African American culture? Now, do you see how that sounds racist? I imagine you would have a big issue with that, and that's exactly why people like myself have an issue with the term toxic masculinity. Now, keep in mind, feminists tell us that we can't call girls bossy because it stops them from becoming self-confident and growing up to be CEOs and the President of the United States.
When I was growing up, I was called bossy.
I think the word bossy is just a squasher.
Being labeled something matters. By middle school,
girls are less interested in leadership than boys.
And that's because they worry about being called bossy.
We need to tell them it's okay to be ambitious.
We need to help them lean in.
Words matter.
Let's just ban the word bossy.
And encourage girls to lead.
To be strong and be ambitious.
So we have to ban the word bossy. But at the same time, it's perfectly okay to refer to males, including little boys, as toxic, referring to their masculinity as something which is toxic. Do you not see an issue with this, Thomas?
And oh my goodness, for a movement that's only about equality and isn't blaming of men. They name the force for evil after men and the force for justice after women. And this being a movement is very, very, very concerned about the implications of language. So concerned that if you call a firefighter a fireman, it will discourage little girls from aspiring to be firefighters. And sometimes discourage grown women from aspiring to be firefighters, right? By calling them firemen. But we can call the force for all oppression. We can call that essentially men. Patriarchy, right? And we can call the force for good and justice women. And that kind of language, that has no implications. We're not blaming men. We just named everything bad after them.
We don't refer to the negative aspects of femininity as toxic femininity, and if we went around and did that, we would be called misogynistic. But it's perfectly okay to throw around the toxic masculinity label, isn't it, Thomas? Do you not see a double standard there? Serious question, do you not see a double standard?
And how it affects men. Because when I tell my wife stuff about what it was like in a locker room, for example, during high school men's sports, she is dumbfounded sometimes. I mean, it is, and I don't blame her, because high school boys do really, really stupid things.
Now, hold on, Thomas. Hold on a second. This is very strange. You're saying that your wife is dumbfounded, but just a couple of minutes ago you were explaining to us how the dominant voice in society has always been the white male voice. You used the words forever, in fact, if I remember correctly. So, shouldn't your wife be able to understand what the male perspective is? Why is she dumbfounded when you explain these things to her? It's, that's a bit strange. It's almost like you just contradicted yourself there. It's almost like your other argument was nonsense or something. Strange, that. But as you're about to acknowledge next, although only in a very minor way, this type of behaviour is done in schools by girls as well. In fact, I've heard of many stories of teenage girls committing suicide because of the bullying they get from other girls, especially on social media. This is something we don't talk about enough for some reason. There's lots of talk by feminists about how evil men are constantly silencing poor defenseless women online, but we never hear about the bullying of females by other females for some strange reason. By the way, can we call that toxic femininity? I'm just curious. Maybe we should talk about it more if that's the case.
And it's sort of extreme. Doesn't mean high school girls don't as well, but I think this is an area where, when it comes to the effects of toxic masculinity, what it makes men do, how it affects us, how what it makes us feel we need to value, I think there's definitely room for men to talk about that. And
yeah, part of the problem is feminists like yourself, Thomas, or maybe you're not a good example, because you do seem a little bit fair on some things at least. But many feminists only want to talk about men's issues through the lens of toxic masculinity, and this is often done in such a way as to turn all the blame for men's issues back on men. Instead of blaming society, it's all the fault of men and the standards that men have and put on other men. And you know what, Thomas? The red pill actually covers this a bit. You know that, right? You've seen the movie.
And Paul, I think as you were saying, we have to look at men just not only as human doings, but also as human beings. When you survive because somebody else is willing to die, like in war, then that you are immune to the pain of the people who are dying because you have an investment in their being willing to die. You say, I will build a statue, I will remember you in a history book. But if you look at that from another perspective, that building of the statue or remembering you in a history book is a bribe to be willing to die so that I can live.
And that's just a bribe for them to be disposable, right? You saw that bit in the movie, right, Thomas? When you watched it, you didn't bring that bit up, surprisingly. I don't know why, but it also wasn't mentioned in the Village Voice. I'm sure that's just a coincidence. But I'm pretty sure you saw that bit in the movie, Thomas, when you actually sat down and watched it. Right?
I'll go so far as to say that if we didn't have men's voices in that issue talking about it, there would be a huge void in that conversation. I don't think, like, if we just only left it to, and I apologize, I want to say at the outset, this is a bit cis-normative here, and I want to say for any of my trans or gender-fluid listeners, I'm just going to be talking about, because toxic masculinity and how it interacts and intersects with trans issues is not something I'm an expert at. I can't really talk about that. I want to acknowledge you and let you know that I apologize if you feel left out of this. I will say that I think these things affect people who are perceived as male and how they go through grade school, high school. I think that's what I'm specifically talking about. Because I think toxic masculinity is a huge problem, and it's something that if you haven't experienced it in that kind of context, in that bullying, locker room, whatever, boys will be boys context, I don't think you would really be able to understand. I do think that men's voices are critical in that situation. So again, just a bit of an olive branch, but what I want to very much emphasize is that the default voice has been the white male voice. That has been the one that has gotten the most play, and once again, it's just like the Christians with the war on Christmas, in my opinion. Once that crumbles a tiny bit, once that monopoly on the narrative crumbles a little bit, I think there's a huge amount of white male overreaction. So another few issues they toss out there, and they don't go too much into these, but they mention, here's things that, feminists don't care about or society doesn't care about that only affect men or disproportionately affect men. Video game addiction, pornography addiction.
Now, when I first heard this podcast, and I heard the bit where Thomas brings up video game addiction and pornography addiction, and then he spent the next 5 minutes talking about it in great detail, as you will see in a few minutes. It really had me scratching my head. Now, I did hear porn and video game addiction mentioned in the Red Pill, but I had to go back and watch the movie again to make sure that my memory was correct. And for the record, it was. So, for proper context, I think we should look at the part of the Red Pill where porn and video game addiction is mentioned, and I think we should have a little timer up in the corner that records the exact amount of time that this movie talks about that topic. Now, keep in mind, the Red Pill is a very long movie. It's 117 minutes. That's almost 2 hours long. So, let's have a look at exactly how long the Red Pill talks about this topic.
Young men that are failing to launch, they're staying in their homes of origin far past the time that we would normally expect them to individuate and move out and go live their lives. We have video game addiction, we have pornography addiction, we have the abuse of young boys with drugs like Ritalin to manage their behavior.
3 seconds, literally 3 seconds of a 117-minute movie, almost 2 hours long, and it spends 3 seconds talking about pornography and video game addiction, and it just mentions them in passing as part of another topic, which is the failure to launch, and even that topic is still just mentioned in passing. So why am I talking about this? Well, like I said, Thomas is about to spend a fair amount of time talking about this topic in great detail, which I find very, very strange, considering when he was talking about parental issues, which is the major men's rights issue discussed in the entire movie, he basically reduced it down to this one point.
I think what frustrates me is they just have some weird, one-sided... She interviews one guy about what his ex-wife did to him,
and ignored all the other information and examples that were given. And now he's taken this minute thing, which is said in passing, and he's elevated it to the point where he's talking about it as if it's a major issue. I just find this an extremely strange thing to do. I would think that the major talking point of the movie should get the majority of the time, and something that's said in passing should, you know, not be considered to be a major point. Am I wrong? Is it just me? But this seems just a little bit too weird to me. And oh yeah, almost forgot to mention, the Village Voice actually mentions porn and video game addiction. I'm sure that's just a coincidence. We have video game addiction, we have pornography addiction, Elam points out, and a propagandist more adept than Jay might not have included so much comic out of gas sputtering. Now, why would the Village Voice include video game addiction and pornography addiction in the article when it's literally mentioned 3 seconds out of a 2-hour movie? Well, my guess is to reinforce a stereotype. You know, the basement-dwelling loser male who eats Cheetos and plays video games and watches porn, and that's their life. And it's an easy way to strawman men's rights into, you know, that type of stereotype and those type of issues. But why is Thomas bringing it up? I don't know. I find it hard to believe that Thomas would do a review without watching the movie. To be perfectly blunt, to be perfectly honest, I know there are others out there who have done exactly that. I've done video responses to them before, but I still find it hard to believe that Thomas, who runs a podcast and obviously does some preparation for the show, would be so stupid as to not watch the movie before responding to it. Yet his choice of argumentation and the things he chooses to focus on and the things he chooses to ignore, it's weird. I just find it weird, and I think that if he has watched the movie, then instead of thinking for himself, he's relied on a lot of other sources like the Village Voice to help form his opinion. Maybe he read the articles beforehand and that informed the way he viewed the movie. Maybe he watched the movie, then he read these articles afterwards. Or, like I've been saying, quite possibly he hasn't watched the movie at all. It's just bizarre the way he ignores things and it leaves them out and focuses on other things. And as you'll hear him say, he claims that the Red Pill blames feminism for video game addiction and pornography addiction. Now, you've seen the 3-second clip where Paul mentioned it in passing as part of the larger issue of young men failing to launch. He didn't say young men are being addicted to porn and video games because feminism is evil. And Thomas should know that. It should have been obvious to Thomas if he'd watched it. I just find the whole thing strange. That's all. Very strange way of arguing from someone who's supposedly seen the movie. But anyway, Thomas is about to go into a very, very long talk about video game and pornography addiction. So let's have a listen to that, shall we?
And this is where I want to emphasize that those both are probably real problems. There's disputes in the research as to how prevalent or how big of an issue it is, but I'll take it for granted that, yeah, those are issues. Now, what I would want to know is where are feminists contributing to that or hindering the research on it, or why is this dichotomy set up as either you have to care about feminism or these issues?
So I'm going to answer Thomas's question in a second, but first just let me make an update. I got this far in the movie and I thought, look, to be 100% fair to Thomas, I really should go and watch part 1 of his review of the Red Pill, just in case there is anything in there which in any way will change my opinion on part 2. Like maybe, for example, he went into the family court in detail in part 1, which would be strange considering his wording in part 2. It definitely seemed like that's the only place he brought up the topic, but I wanted to be 100% sure, and I was correct. He doesn't talk about the family court in part 1. And he sums up 30-40 minutes of the movie as she chats to one guy, and that's it. And I've got to say, now that I've listened to part 1 as well, I've changed my opinion a little bit. I think now that Thomas probably has watched the movie, but he is just so dogmatically blind, incredibly blind, to the point where I think this guy is unreachable. No matter how many facts or how much evidence you present to him, I think he is so dogmatically invested in feminism and in his belief system that he will never ever listen or change his opinion. He is entrenched in it, and his part 1 really fucking pissed me off, because all it was poisoning the well and making excuses for men's issues not being real, constantly saying feminism isn't to blame, claiming that MRAs are all, white Trump supporters and only support white men's issues.
Because what's so ironic about all this is these MRAs are Trump supporters. They are huge Trump supporters because they hate women, and they love that Trump said a bunch of horrible stuff about women, and they love that culture war. But isn't it unfortunate that it's the Democrats who would want to do stuff about homelessness? It's the Democrats who aren't the party of, help yourself. Like, God will help you if you help yourself kind of thing.
This guy is so fucking blind, and he thinks he knows what he's arguing. He thinks he knows what he's talking about, and he doesn't have a fucking clue. Just not a single fucking clue. He's basically arguing against a stereotype.
But when you watch this movie, and moreover, when you see not a whitewashed version of these people, when you see what they actually say online and how they act, it's women hating is all it is. It's shrouded in these little statistical issues that they've tried to find, but that's not what the point is. The point is the women hating, and then the justification comes after, in my opinion. Otherwise, why on earth would the male suicide method lead you to say horrible things about women, which I could play a clip later on. They just say awful things about women all the time. You can find countless examples of it. You don't even have to dig.
And his entire opinion is based on a dogmatic belief in feminism. And that, Thomas, that is the very reason that we have an issue with feminism. If you want to know why MRAs have an issue with feminists, it's because of people like you. You are so fucking sure of yourself. You are so full of yourself. And yet you are so incredibly blind.
So I'm asking myself, like, how did this happen? And in researching this, because I'm not... It's hard for me to buy the idea that this is 100% genuine. Like, you never know. Maybe someone is so feeble intellectually that they're convinced by MRA arguments after previously being a feminist. I mean, maybe. That's hard to believe. Could be.
Astoundingly blind. It's just stunning to watch. It really is. But anyway, let's continue with Thomas talking about the issue of video game and porn addiction, because that 3 seconds of the red pill was so very important, much more important than the 40 minutes on the family court. So let's hear his opinion on that, shall we?
I mean, there are a billion issues that I don't pay attention to in my everyday life that I'm sure that if I happen to catch a documentary on, and I happen to see a charity that said, donate $10 to research to help such and such, that I would do it. It's just we're as humans, we're a bit myopic in that we kind of the last issue we see is what we tend to care about, or what affects us or our home, our family, or friends. So I'll confess that video game addiction or porn addiction aren't two issues that I care that much about. I don't know anyone, or they don't affect me necessarily. But it's not just that, though. They may very well be issues, but I would want to know, what are the costs, what are the numbers, and furthermore, what are the potential solutions? Because it is one of those things that, again, when the other side of this tend to be all about individual responsibility, what are we going to do about it? Should we make video games less addictive? Should we mandate that the government intervene? Or should we, do we need to devote public resources to it? If it's something that we're proven to be having a big effect in our society, to the point where, we're losing all kinds of productivity, or people are dying because of it, then, yeah, I would be open to initiatives to help that. But I don't think it's that level on either of these things, video game addiction or porn addiction. And they're things that largely rest on you and seeking help. So here's what I do support. And once again, this is why I firmly believe if you are an MRA, you should be a Democrat. You should vote Democrat, because what I would support is being able to get help, having access to healthcare, and therefore having access to therapy. So if you are suffering from this, if you feel like video game addiction or porn addiction is affecting your life and it's stopping you from doing things, I would want you to have access to healthcare, to be able to go to a therapist, or whatever research shows is the appropriate response to that. I'm sure therapy is a good place to start to find out, what do we need to do to fix this.
Now, you'll note at no point does Thomas mention failure to launch, which is what the video game and porn addiction was in reference to, in context to. I would think that if you've seen the movie, you would be talking about failure to launch, and possibly mentioned porn and video game addiction as a symptom of that. But it's almost like Thomas hasn't seen the movie and is just reading this from a list or something, or possibly an article.
I think it's also a bit ironic when it comes to video games, because so much of Gamergate was women saying, hey, let's maybe make games a little better for women, like more geared toward women, and a lot of men freaking out about that.
Okay, Gamergate is not the men's rights movement, Thomas. I know your entire argument rests on just picking random people you don't like and random groups you don't like and claiming that they're MRAs because there's some overlap. By the way, Thomas, why do you hate trans women so much? Obviously, your feminism overlaps with the TERF, so why do you hate trans women, Thomas? But I gotta say, the overlap argument is really a poor one. Yeah, sure, there were MRAs who were part of Gamergate, but there were also feminists who were part of Gamergate. Did you forget that? Does Gamergate now represent feminism because of overlap? But anyway, let's continue.
And step one, by the way, we don't have good data on right now how much video game addiction, A, like how prevalent it is, B, how much it disproportionately affects boys versus girls or men versus women. We don't have great data on that because I think it's going to be inaccurate if it's older than mobile phones. I've seen a lot of sources for like 2008, and it's like, okay, well, I think a significant factor right now, that data may have been valid back then, but I think a significant factor is going to be these mobile games, because I've actually seen stats that women prefer those, and the gender balance is much different when it comes to those kinds of games. And the data I'm seeing on just video game usage, it's not that big of a gap, and it has shrunk in recent years. So, A, I don't think this is necessarily that disproportionate to men. But B, I think a solution, one thing that would make it more evenly split is if Anita Sarkeesian et al. Had their way and games were geared more toward women or girls, or just, less toward violence and stuff. And by the way, that doesn't mean getting rid necessarily of certain games. It could just mean incorporating more games and having more diversity there. So that, I found that kind of interesting, kind of ironic in a way. But I'll end this little section by saying, once again, A, feminists are not actively adding to this problem. In fact, I think they are solving it. They're largely either neutral or helping it. So this is not a dichotomy. This is not a choice. It's not either feminism or video game and porn addiction.
I don't believe anyone in the movie said it was a choice between those two things, Thomas. Have you watched the movie?
And B, if you were addicted to... I was going to say if you were addicted to porn or addicted to video games, which party would you rather have in power? But I would actually widen that to, if you are addicted to anything, who would you rather have in power, Democrats or Republicans? Republicans love punishing addicts for their behavior, and Democrats tend to favor treatment, reducing sentences for stuff. By the way, Democrats tend to favor giving you access to health care. I don't say tend. Right now it is strictly party line. Like, Democrats want you to have access to health care. Republicans want you to fend for yourself and just, if you can afford massive premiums, then Republicans are not going to physically stop you from paying those massive premiums. That's as far as they'll go. And the reason I keep bringing up the Democrat-Republican thing, it's not exactly 100% because of Red Pill. I mean, it sort of is, because I did see that most of the people involved and interviewed with Red Pill were Trump supporters. I want to emphasize not all, because someone called me out on, I think one of them supported Hillary, and there may be one or two, but most of them I found quotes that they support Trump. And so that's, it's a level of going against your own self-interest that I think reveals the game. The game is not, I care about these issues. The game is, I don't like feminists. I want to go against the party that tends to be associated with feminism, which is Democrats.
So Thomas just stated that MRAs don't really care about men's issues. They just don't like Democrats. And they don't like Democrats because Democrats are associated with feminism. Yeah, this guy is a complete and utter fucking asshole. First of all, Thomas, I'd like to inform you that not everyone is an American. I know this may be a little bit hard for your American-centric brain to understand this, but outside of America, there is a big world. So unless you're suggesting that the very large men's rights movement in India move to America, and I'm sure you would help them all get green cards, I'm sure that wouldn't be a hassle. So unless you're suggesting they all move to America and then start voting Democrat, I think your way of thinking is very limited and very American-centric and isn't looking at the big picture. that a total shock. It really is. I'm surprised that Thomas Smith isn't looking at the big picture. It's mind-boggling, really. And of course, I think the reason why Thomas is doing this is once more due to his dogma. He starts with the conclusion that people should vote for Democrats, and therefore that's the solution to everything. Of course, not taking into account fucking reality in any conceivable way. And if you truly think, Thomas, that the Democrats give two shits about men's issues and men's rights, you're even more ignorant than I thought. Now, that's not to say that the right wing is any better. Well, hold on. Let me self-correct myself. I should say much better. Recently, the right wing, or elements of the right wing, have started to support men's rights and men's rights issues, but only as a means of attacking feminism. Because feminism is so dead against any discussion of men's rights, and so dead against the men's rights movement, elements of the right wing see the MRM as a means of attacking feminism. Now, that doesn't mean they give two shits about our issues. That doesn't mean that they actually support the change we want. Most of them are perfectly happy with traditional gender roles, which we in the men's rights movement see as restrictive. And the ironic thing about people like Thomas constantly referring to MRAs as being, you know, the evil right-wingers, is I see some people who are right-wingers referring to A Voice for Men as being leftist. So, you know, you can't win with these people, right? If someone's on the far left, they see everyone else as being far right. And if someone's on the far right, they see everyone else as being far left. Yeah, it doesn't really reflect reality though, does it, Thomas?
So that's why I bring it up, because in the backdrop of this, and the people who are referencing these arguments are largely anti-feminists. Largely, not all. Largely anti-feminists. Largely people who support Trump, or at least, you know, hate the Democrats and think that identity politics is ruining them. So that's why I bring it up. I really do firmly believe that if you genuinely care about these issues, and you just want, you're not anti-feminist, you just want to solve these men's issues, then you should be a Democrat.
So just as I was finishing up this video, I noticed that two of my favourite YouTubers have both put up videos dismantling toxic masculinity. And since toxic masculinity was a big argument used by one Mr. Thomas Smith in this video, I thought I would give you a sample of those two videos. I'll have links to them below. Please go and check out their videos and sub to their channels. You won't regret it.
Toxic masculinity has many convoluted definitions, but it basically means how men are pressured by society to act in certain ways perceived as manly that are ultimately harmful to themselves. However, women also act in certain ways perceived as womanly that are ultimately harmful to themselves. All of this, while what is perceived as harmful is very subjective and therefore has very different meanings, depends on who you're asking. So the term toxic masculinity is a vague term which refers to a human condition, yet got gendered to specifically target men. If you're intellectually honest enough, then you must admit that this is because it was made up by people highly motivated by personal and political agendas that took an unwanted common human behavior and turned it into a social political weapon to attack men.
I'm sure many of you have heard the phrase toxic masculinity. It's one of those ideas that gets brought up a lot, but is never really justified. It's just kind of assumed as a starting point before talking about some other issue. So today I'd like to investigate a little, and the first question I'd like to bring up is, what does toxic masculinity even mean? The short answer is, I don't know. Some people use it to mean hyper-masculinity, but other people say it's any amount of masculinity. It really depends who you ask. Perhaps a more specific question, and a more useful question, would be, to whom is masculinity toxic? Dictionaries and academic sources usually claim that it's toxic to men themselves because it makes them feel inadequate and not manly enough, but individual feminists often claim that the real victims are women because men feel the need to be aggressive and violent. Regardless of who you agree with, I think the most important thing to point out in these discussions is the fact that, regardless of who it hurts, any behavior can be toxic. Any behavior can be toxic, so to speak, in extreme amounts, both extremely high and extremely low, and depending on the circumstances. For example, take the often cited toxic masculine trait of emotional flatness. It can be bad in high amounts when dealing with personal problems, but it can also be very good in high amounts when facing a physical or logistical challenge. As an example of this, search for everyday heroes on YouTube, and notice that it's mostly men who, for example, jump onto the train tracks to save the kid, or who walk through traffic to help an old person. You really can't do these things unless you suppress your fear and give priority to the situation. As another example, take aggression. Is aggression toxic or not? Well, it depends. My main problem with the way many feminists talk about masculinity is the fact that they don't seem to make any of these distinctions. To them, it seems that a trait is either good or bad, regardless of the situation, and sometimes regardless of the amount as well. And surprise, surprise, guess which gender-typical traits are singled out for that gender to correct about themselves? I mean, after all, women are just helpless animals floating in the raging sea of our patriarchal culture that men created. So any toxic traits that women may have are forever beyond their control, right? I mean, once we fix masculinity, that'll somehow fix everything, right? And unfortunately, that does bring us to the question, what about toxic femininity? I know, it's a tired talking point. What about toxic femininity? I know the accusation has been leveled 1,000,000 times, but let me just give you my summary of it, hopefully in a more constructive way than most people have summarized it in the past. This accusation is usually leveled at people who defend their use of the phrase toxic masculinity by saying that they just want to help men deal with unrealistic expectations and being forced into gender roles, which is certainly admirable and sounds very altruistic, but it's also very curious, because if that were the case, you would expect these people to also be concerned about what they would call toxic femininity, since you could just as easily apply these descriptions to women in those exact words, if not more so than men. After all, you hear feminists talk about unfair standards and gender roles all the time as they pertain to women, but curiously, they never identify these things as toxic femininity, despite calling the exact same things toxic masculinity when they apply to men. So what's going on here? In my experience, most gender feminists would respond to the question of toxic femininity by saying something like, masculinity is toxic because it's men holding themselves to impossible or harmful standards, whereas femininity is not toxic because, while women are also held to impossible and harmful standards, women aren't the ones perpetuating those standards, and women aren't the ones who created those standards thousands of years ago. It was all men. So toxic femininity is just another word for patriarchy. Or, to put it a little less charitably, they would say, women don't have any significant influence on our culture and they never have, so everything that's bad about our culture and its gender roles is entirely men's fault. If you're doing it to yourself, it's toxic, but if it's being done to you, it's oppression. No matter how you phrase it, I call bullshit. Women do affect culture, women do have influence on gender roles, and women do generate and enforce ideas about men and other women, just like men do. Ooh, right, but that makes it sound like women have even a tiny amount of agency, so you know that can't possibly be an accurate description of the Western world, right?